Thanks, Mike. Thank you all for coming today. I kind of almost expected a little bit smaller crowd, so I'm gonna have to bring up the nerves a little bit. But I'm going to deviate a little bit from the abstract that was sent out, largely because I wanted to make this a little bit more comparative and discussion about how policy transfer might look between the United States and the UK. So I'm going to start by talking about both countries, and I'm going to be pulling together two different projects, which is why there's so many names on this slide here. So myself, Dr. Kelsey Henderson, and then Brian Renauer are funded by the National Institute of Justice in the United States to study decriminalization of drug possession that's been going on in Oregon. So they've decriminalized all drug possession up to a certain quantity, and we've been provided a large grant to say that we're in year 3 of that. So we're going to be reporting on some of those findings, and then the second England Wales-based project is with the second set of names there, Dr. Monaghan, Alex Stevens, and then Charlie as well. So I'll talk more about those in a minute, but real quick, I have to give a disclaimer. Some of this is funded by the National Institute of Justice and because it's through the US-UK Fulbright Commission. The findings and perspectives and opinions here do not reflect those of any government or any government agency. So, with that being said. Yeah, thanks. Okay, as I mentioned, I'm going to first be talking about Oregon and Oregon's successive interventions, not just decriminalization. There was only it was only feasible for Oregon to embark on this decriminalization effort because of these other aspects that they've done prior to that, which include things like justice reinvestment, cannabis, and so on. I'm going to talk more about this in a second. And then I'm going to move into discussing out-of-court disposal. So how does England and Wales go about addressing kind of the same branch of drug offenders as they come in touch with the system? So how do you use police officers in particular to either divert or pull people into the system, depending on what they're doing in the situation? And then lastly, I'm going to talk about what can be learned from both, and maybe a little bit from the US to bring into the UK and vice versa. So, broadly speaking, the United States, as you probably already know, has been experiencing a skyrocketing issue with drug overdoses. This is largely due to the rise of fentanyl. This has been documented in a recent study that showed how fentanyl has kind of raced across the nation from east to west. And as it approached the different states, we saw a major spike in that state's drug-related deaths. In addition to that, we've got 1.4 million drug possession arrests per year, right? So that's all the states across the nation. Each state, of course, varies. Oregon's on the slightly lower end per capita, but nevertheless, there's a lot of people getting swept into those are the state level courts and state level prisons or supervision because of low level drug offending. And that's not even including the federal level. 50 to 60% of those 1.4 million drug possession arrests are prosecuted, and 90% of those are then convicted. This just highlights the fact that there's a lot of plea agreements that are reached through these folks. And typically it's because the process is indeed the punishment, as Malcolm Fielding noted in the 70s. It is still that way. There's not a lot that has changed. So this kind of highlights the need to actually lean into and understand why and how these people actually come in contact with the system. How do they stick around? Do they really need to be there? In the United Kingdom, there has been, the ONS has indicated that there's been 10 consecutive years of increase in drug overdoses. While it's not at the same levels as the United States, it's still increasing incrementally and steadily. In addition to that, there's over 133,000 possession offenses in the last year from 2022 to 2023, and 22% of those are charged or sentenced to court, which is pretty sizable. Per capita in particular. All that's to say that this approach to drug offenses, especially low level, is really unsustainable both socially and fiscally for both countries. It's too expensive and it's too damaging to people's lives. unnecessarily damaging. So when it comes to Oregon specifically, the red area there were 4 successive policy shifts that Oregon actively tried to implement. And 2 of them were done by the voters, 2 of them were done by the legislature. So in the state of Oregon, we are able to actually enact law as voters, so long as you get it on the ballot and enough people vote for it, ultimately. Which is what happened with cannabis and ballot measure 110 in 2015 and 2021 respectively. I should start. The first successive or the first policy shift was by the legislature in this attempt to reduce prison use. It's called justice reinvestment. The idea is that you divert people who are low-level drug offenders, property offenders, etc., driving. You divert them from the system entirely, actively. So these are people who are prison bound, and you put them on probation instead. That's the aim. But it's incentivized. It is not mandatory that any prosecutor does this. So you can imagine there's a lot of fluctuation among the counties. Cannabis was legalized by the voters in 2015 across the board. We joined 4 states at the time, including our sister state to the north, Washington, which had done it the year prior. And then defelonization, we took a lot of the drug possessions, low-level drug possessions of a certain quantity, and instead of treating them as a felony, which is the most serious crime, more serious category of crime in the United States, which would lead you to prison ultimately, we could then reclassified it as a misdemeanor, which would more likely bring you to probation. And then ballot measure 110, which is the voter initiated decriminalization of all drug possession up to a certain quantity, all drugs, right? Not just prescription, not just cannabis, or cannabis isn't illegal anymore, heroin, fentanyl, etc. The rationale here is, of course, the more diversion that you apply, the less people are going to prison, or less people are going actually through the criminal justice system. And so you have fewer prosecutions, you have less social costs, less fiscal cost. So to analyze this, these successive shifts, I employed 2 different processes. You won't see the modeling necessarily of one of them. It's kind of baked into the results. But ultimately, looking at the research question, have these interventions had a detectable effect on Oregon's prosecution practices in particular, but also crime rates? The analysis used interrupted time series over 190 months. So this includes general least squares regression. I won't get into a lot of the details unless you really want me to. And then the second stage or second analysis really is a maximum likelihood estimation mixed effects model. So I allowed for the effects to be varying within the county. So it's nested in the counties. There are 36 counties in Oregon. And as I mentioned, a lot of them will operate independently as if there's 36 states within the state. There's the successive drug shifts again. There's 2 other things to mention. One is March 2020, obviously, everybody was impacted by COVID. We have to model that in some way. I'll talk about a little bit of that if you want me to dive into more specifics after the talk. I'm happy to do so. But ultimately, try to account for the restrictiveness that was applied in the immediate month of the shutdown and then successively afterwards. Then lastly is February 2024. This year, the state decided to recriminalize drug possession, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. The key outcomes was to look at changes in trends, and the specific trends related to law enforcement, so arrests and arresting charges, prosecution, so the charges that actually went to court ultimately, or at least were filed through the court, and then also public safety, which is property and violent crimes reported by the police, as recorded in the FBI crime statistics or the Uniform Crime Report up to a certain date, about 2019, and then NIVERS or the National Incident-Based Reporting System after that, and then also drug-related deaths as recorded by the Oregon Health Authority. Additionally, included loads of control measures coming from multiple different areas. So that includes the Federal Reserve economic data, which compiles a lot of different areas, Bureau of Labor, Census, and then in addition to those, I pulled in drug seizure information from the high intensity drug trafficking area data. So HIDA. This is a federal effort to try to pull in multiple different local jurisdictions to figure out how much of the drug of a given drug is being seized at any given time in a particular county. Not all the counties are participating in this, but most of those that are along any type of major roadway are. The county control measures, the biggest ones to account for, obviously population, which helped me create the rates. But the percent of disconnected youth was a major predictor in a lot of these models, which includes 16 to 24-year-olds, a percent of 16 to 24-year-olds who are enrolled, not enrolled in school and unemployed, right? So they're completely disconnected theoretically. And then, of course, the unemployment rate and then inflation as well. So, keep my eye on the time. So this graph is a plot of a few different things. All of the dots that you see, and this will be the same for the rest of the graphs throughout. The dots, the scatter plot, is the actual observed monthly, in this case, monthly rates, or yes, monthly rates. And then the smooth lines are the predicted trends without any predictors. Okay, so they're just using time. Then the squiggly lines, the ones that jump up and down, those are the predicted lines in the trends in relation to all other predictors that we included in the model. And this is for the state of Oregon. So the PCS charges, or the possession of controlled substances, possession charges, are the green. If you can see green, if you are colorblind, I'm very sorry. I really hope that you can see this. But the green, and they're kind of hard to distinguish, but the green starts on top and then goes lower, is on the lower side, and that uses the right y-axis. So it's a rather complicated graph, and I apologize for that. The blue are PCS arrests. Okay, that is starts low, goes high. That uses the left axis. All of this is the arrests are per 100,000 in the population. The charges are per 100 arrests. Okay, it's not everybody in the population, of course, eligible for a charge, so it doesn't make sense to keep the same denominator. When it comes to possession arrests, we find that the trajectory of possession, those possession arrests actually slowed a little bit after JRI, justice reinvestment, but it didn't really have much of an effect. We wouldn't expect it to, really. It did drop substantially after defelonization, which you kind of expect it to do after you reclassify a drug or this particular crime. Dropped significantly again at COVID, and then dropped one more time at measure 110. You can kind of see it successively across the way. And cannabis legalization is thrown in there as well. There's a spoiler alert. There's no effect of cannabis legalization whatsoever. So if you're looking for it, it's not there. Okay. I'm not going to talk about it that much, except for at the end. Possession charges has a similar pattern, except for a short-lived increase at COVID, so which was rather interesting, and a recent rise in measure 110 after a significant drop. So one of the big things to keep in mind, though, when we're talking about charges, it ultimately translates into the number of people, right? How many people are still getting swept into the system? And that's one of the things that I also examined. It's not in here because I wanted to spare you yet another line to look at. But there are ultimately fewer PCS defendants after defelonization, COVID, and measure 110. So after decriminalization. Justice reinvestment had no effect, which I think it's going to hit like a thud when it comes out and the state figures out that they're spending a bunch of money that's not really changing the number of defendants that are going through the system. Largely because of different counties. When we're looking at crime rates, property crime in particular, we see decreases with relation to significant decreases associated with justice reinvestment and cannabis legalization. So, okay, so a little bit of effect there, sorry. But that's pretty much it. Everything else related to property offenses was no, in spite of the fact that you see it increase after measure 110. This is largely rebounding to pre-COVID levels, which is what we see largely across the nation and in other countries. But if you were to rip a headline from Portland or Oregon generally, they would say property crime is increasing. Crime is increasing, and it's because of measure 110. Set the stage for its repeal ultimately, even though there's really no effect. Inflation was largely a better predictor of that rebound than any type of effect related to Measure 110. Violent crime was not associated with any of these drug shifts at all. So anybody that says that a reduction in the use or the prosecution of drugs will actually increase violence, there's no evidence here, right? And I've yet to see that evidence. Fewer possession of defendants were associated with lower rates of property crime. So if you are able to reduce, so if you're able to reduce the number of defendants going through the system, there might be a relationship there. You might be able to actually reduce crime rates, which is kind of an interesting thing. Not that surprising when you start to unpack some of the criminological theory there. Finally, with relation to drug overdose deaths, it's been a flat trend. And I think this is one of the most interesting things. From 2008 up until about 2019, it was a completely flat trend. There was really nothing to talk about in terms of drug-related deaths. Once it started to leaning into COVID, you see a slight increase. Once COVID hit, there seemed to be a major increase, and then that continued through Measure 110. If I were to take the Measure 110 line out, you wouldn't notice that anything happened there, right? Again, a lot of politicians and a lot of rhetoric were connecting verbally and anecdotally, connecting Measure 110 and then decriminalization to increases in drug-related deaths. It does not exist, okay? Especially when we control for all those measures. More importantly, when you control for fentanyl, you start to see why. So this is a crazy graph, and I apologize for that. But drug-related deaths, everything here is associated with the left axis, except for the stair-step red line, which is fentanyl. So this is fentanyl tox screen reports that are reported by the state. That is on the right axis. Drug-related deaths are the gray dots. You can see it just remains rather steady until you see an increase in the fentanyl. And that is what's really driving these, right? As I mentioned, a paper just came out recently out of New York that was talking about this shift across the nation. This is driving almost all of the drug-related deaths. So when people say it's really related because of pretrial reform, which people will say, or it's because of there's not enough available treatment, which is true, but you've still got fentanyl on the market. It's related to the decriminalization or defelonization. We don't see any evidence of that. It is all driven by fentanyl. So that came the recriminalization. Ultimately, it won the voters over, it won legislators over. You had a lot of people with lived experience who were saying the criminal justice system saved my life, which is undeniable. However, it's not the majority of the cases, right? So now it is returned to a misdemeanor. So where the penalty is 30 to 180 days in jail with a penalty of a $1,200 fine. And it's the only diversion aim now is an incentivized idea that counties should use deflection. What is deflection? It's basically an informal out-of-court disposal, which brings us to UK. Using these out-of-court disposals, right? They look a lot like what Oregon has just started implemented as of 3 weeks ago. So I should say, for those of you who aren't familiar with out-of-court disposals, this is a police-level diversion effort for low-level adult offending and youth offenders that tries to keep them away from court and custody. The aim is to reduce systematic harm, reoffending, and address underlying causes at the same time. 51% of 68,000 cases in 2022-2023, possession cases that were specifically out-of-court disposals. So it's being used at least half the time, if not more, depending on the PFA, the police force area. They typically take 2 tiers of out-of-court disposals in these outcomes. So formal cautions, which include police outcomes 2, 3, and 6. These are cautions for youth, cautions for adults, and penalty notices for disorder. So these are things that actually have a criminal record tied to them. Ultimately, you can find this criminal record associated with that person, which is kind of the harm. That is kind of the longevity in the harm process, right? Mm-hmm. Ideally, you're using informal cautions for really low-level offenses such as cannabis. That includes outcomes 7 and 8. And 22 should be on there, which is a new outcome, and it is combined with my measure ultimately. But those informal cautions are really trying to be pushed across all police force areas to try and increase that use of informal cautions because it doesn't have that formal tie, that doesn't have that criminal history to it. So the aim here in some police force areas is to include or increase the informal out-of-court disposals and particularly tie it with treatment of some kind. And in some of these areas, it's been educational treatment. So specifically, I want to focus on the West Midlands. In the West Midlands, they ultimately mandated that police use diversion to do a light touch, quote unquote, educational treatment consistently, okay, across the board. It is not like piecemeal. We're going to try to do this for as many people as possible, so all officers need to do it. The aim is to reduce the social and physical harm by diverting those low-level drug offenders away from the system. As I mentioned previously, all diversion is really for that. But in this scheme, ideally, low-level drug possession is the subject is actually offered diversion or divert, is the name of it, and informal out-of-court disposals with no criminal record. Willing subjects, so they have to agree to this, are first booked by the officer through a Cranston app on the officer's phone. That first step is a telephone assessment and harm reduction advice from Cranston, which is the service provider. And then the second step is developing or at least having the person come in for a group educational session, discussing all the harms and the problems with substance use. No action is really taken largely if the subject fails to comply with any of this. Although the subject can be offered divert as many times as necessary, depending on the situation. They leave it up to the officer's discretion in that way. So, similar approach here to assess the effect of divert and try to unpack COVID as best as I can, using a two-stage analysis. The first is a synthetic control analysis, which is a little bit different than before. It's still kind of it's a time series analysis, which if you're familiar with propensity score modeling or case control matching or anything like that, it's that essentially for time series. So where we essentially identify and weight comparison police force areas to the treatment area, which is the West Mids. Okay. Then I take those weights and I put them into an interrupted time series so that I can then control for the effect of COVID as best as I can, because it is very close in terms of time. It's exactly 2 quarters worth in quarterly data because it's not available in monthly as it was in Oregon. 2 other areas, Durham and Thames Valley, are also using some type of divert effort like this, diversion effort. I'm leaving them out of the analysis for now because I only have so much time. Also, this is an active research project, so some of these are still getting refined. If you have suggestions as we go, please let me know. And similar to the Oregon effort, I pulled in a lot of control measures or several control measures, some of which I pulled apart from the same area, such as the indices of multiple deprivation. So where it's collected sporadically. So if for a police force area, ultimately I created an average, a standard deviation, a maximum and a minimum, and then interpolated it over the, basically stretched it across the time series. And so each police force area had that, tried to control for a number of other things, such as police stops per 1,000 citizens in the police force area, the number of officers per 1,000 citizens, etc. The intervention here is divert, as I mentioned, in which I pulled apart the 2 different types of out-of-court disposals, the formal and the informal. And then there's also the outcome, obviously, which is to focus on how many people, or how many charges rather, and in some cases defendants, were we able to pull away from court. So how did this actually affect the court summons rate for drug offenses? As well as, did it have an impact on crime at all? Because that's some of the most recent media articles on out-of-court disposals, specifically as it relates to domestic violence, but in other crimes as well, suggest that this is a lenient way to deal with offenders. And it's not really helping anybody. It's actually making matters worse. So it's actually increasing crime. So it was claimed. So we're going to take it to the test. For the West Mids, as before, the scatter plot is the observed. The smooth line is predicted without predictors, without extra covariates. And then the more jagged line is the prediction with covariates in it. Largely able to model the shape and the change for each of these, even though it's quarterly, so there's far fewer. But in this case, divert was associated with an increase in the rate of out-of-court cautions for drug offenses. So you have blue, that is drug or any cautions, the orange, that is formal cautions, and then informal cautions is the green. You can see that by the time COVID hits, informal cautions is becoming the primary, if not only way that officers really approach drug possession cases. Okay. So following divert, the West Mids uses almost exclusively informal out-of-court disposals. Taking those informal out-of-court disposals and then comparing them, this is just a plot of basically a scatter or a line plot, right? So there's no modeling going on here. I just wanted to compare them and show you what they look like in relation to other areas that are also using informal out-of-court disposals, which are many of them. So the black dotted line here, or sorry, black solid line is the West Mids. The red is Greater Manchester. The green is Nottinghamshire, and the blue is the average for all of England and Wales. Okay, you can see that among these in particular, which are some of the larger ones, leaving Metro out, that the West Mids is actually on the lower side, right? And they're kind of with divert, if it did actually increase, which this modeling kind of suggests it does, it's actually bringing them up to the national average, right? Because they were used so infrequently. So when it comes to the synthetic control, I'm not going to go through a lot of this, but the point here, the takeaway is that the blue dots on this graph shows that all the covariates that were really different as it spans away from that center line of 0, that shows the bias, how different all of the comparison cases were, all the comparison police force areas were compared to the West Mids. Once you weight them using the synthetic control design, you see the red X's along that 0, it's essentially remove that bias, stating, or at least setting up the stage to say that the synthetic control actually replicates the pre-divert characteristics of the West Mids. So we want to control them, we want to make them look as closely like one another up until the intervention, and then let them diverge. Okay. So when you think about those, how wide that distribution was, and you apply the synthetic control, you can see how much closer these kind of the average of the average of the comparisons got to the West Mids. The dark solid line and the solid dots are the West Mids. The rest is an average of all the controls weighted, okay? As they approach those two vertical lines, which are COVID, first one, and then divert, which is the second one. Ultimately, divert was associated with an increase of about 5 per 100,000, 5 out-of-court disposals, informal out-of-court disposals for drug offenses per 100,000, but it was not significant, not statistically significant, ultimately. So divert was likely helping to correct the COVID trend, which dropped, right? So we're going to take those informal controls, the trends of the informal out-of-court disposals, and use it now as a control to help predict what's happening with prosecutions. So in proceeds and summons, so this is outcome number 1 for all police, right? We ultimately find that divert is associated with a slight decrease in the rate of proceeds and summons for drug offenses, and it is not statistically significant. This is largely because COVID did a lot of the work for them, right? It already suppressed a lot of the prosecutions, the summons for court. What divert likely did, though, is keep it suppressed, right? As you can see, the rest of the controls were steadily climbing, or at least returning to or maintaining the pre-COVID norm. So we've reduced prosecutions, ultimately, through divert, or at least it suggests it does. Does this have an effect on property or violent crime rate? If we reduce prosecutions for drug possession cases, in this case, it shows that not really. There's no effect on property crime. There's no difference here between West Mids and the synthetic control. When it comes to violent crime rates, it actually had, oddly, when you look at this, you're going to think, well, it looks like it increased because of this. It started the increase during COVID, which means divert actually has a decrease. It shifted that trend from upward to flat. And it starts to decrease, right? Starts to drop a little bit. Not saying that divert is necessarily associated with decreasing violent crime rates, but it is likely, given all the controls that we have in the synthetic comparison group, is likely associated with some type of relaxing of the trend, right? So it was quite steep prior to this. And this helps to suggest that it had a hand in it, likely. So what does all this mean, right? I was actually able to wrap this up quicker than I thought. So I'm happy to go back if you're confused. Work your board meeting today. So what does this all mean? Decriminalization in Oregon likely had a positive effect when it comes to the system effects, right? When it comes to pulling people into the system unnecessarily, maybe reducing the number of criminal offenses, criminal histories, criminal records, it was likely positive. Legalizing cannabis continues to yield no effect or positive effects, if any. Decriminalization also showed to reduce arrests and prosecutions for possession cases in Oregon. And there was little to no relationship on crime and drug-related deaths, in spite of what the media would say and politicians. When it comes to the United Kingdom, or at least England and Wales rather, out-of-court disposals with the light touch treatment, DX treatment, we see that there's likely an increase in cautions, decrease in prosecutions, and no effect on crime, except for maybe a flattening of the violent crime rate. COVID is like the driver for the initial drop in proceeds and summons. However, divert policy likely created a way for the West Mids to sustain that reduction beyond the COVID drop. And then the divert policy was also likely created as a way, for the West Mids to sustain all other reductions or changes rather. So what does this mean in terms of policy transfer? Well, one of the things I think Oregon can provide for the UK and England and Wales particularly is that cannabis legalization would not be a terrible thing, right? And I know that's wild to think in England and Wales, and probably it may have been broached at one point, but honestly, you are spending millions of pounds ultimately. For what? That it's got to be ultimately discussed as to what the purpose is of having cannabis in particular criminalized, right? Because there's a lot of resources going into it. There's a lot of potential social damaging effects to the folks who are swept in because of cannabis. As the United States continues to legalize cannabis across the nation, you have more and more examples to look at. And ultimately, you will find a state that looks a lot like your police force area. You can compare them, right? It just depends on the types of measures that you're using. When it comes to Oregon, we have a possible path forward with out-of-court disposals. There's a lot to be learned here from England and Wales. There's a lot of good things with relation to informal out-of-court disposal. There doesn't need to be a criminal record, even with serious drug use, right? Heroin, for instance, meth, which are very prominent in the United States, right? Particularly if you're able to connect that informal out-of-court disposal or deflection with some type of treatment, which is the critical thing. Finally, next steps, moving forward with both these projects, trying to continue to pull in as many metrics as I can. There's only a couple more that I really need, that I really want for the UK specifically, such as something like disconnected youth. Drug seizure information is rather hard to get at the quarterly level, it's lower. And then assess differences across sex, age, and race or ethnicity in the UK in particular. The same goes for Oregon, but the metrics for ethnicity, as you can imagine, if you've ever done that type of research, are quite poor. And then finally, continued comparative analysis as we can compare to the Netherlands and Portugal in particular, as Oregon modeled its decriminalization effort from Portugal. Right, so that brings us to the end. Thank you.